Welcome, everyone. I'm Zubair Qamar from Zubair's Bookshelf. We have joining us Dr. Faris Abdel-hadi, author of the amazing book, Ibn Arabi's Religious Pluralism, Levels of Inclusivity. So this book is set to release in December of this year, and we're excited to have Dr. Abdel-hadi here to know more about him and about the book. This conversation will be in two parts. First, getting to know the author, Dr. Abdel-hadi, and his journey, and then delving into the insights and impact of his new work. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Faris Abdel-hadi. Dr. Abdel-hadi, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me on here.
Getting to the first question. Dr. Abdel-hadi, can you please tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up, where your roots are from, which countries you have lived in, and so forth?
I'm a Palestinian Jordanian who grew up in Dubai. I was actually born in Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates, but I spent the majority of my youth in Dubai, after which I went to the UK to complete my undergraduate and postgraduate studies.
And you're living in Jordan right now, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Correct. In Amman.
And when did you go to the UK to do your PhD?
I actually didn't go to the UK to do my PhD because this happened during the era of COVID when traveling wasn't allowed, right? So I actually did my PhD long distance.
Okay, so you were doing your PhD from Jordan, right?
Yes, that's right.
So what other education do you have besides your PhD?
Yeah, sure. So my undergraduate studies was in business management, and then I wanted to focus on law, so I completed my postgraduate studies in law, what's called a GDL and LPC course in the UK. And I also did a 1-year master's degree in Cambridge in criminology, as random as that sounds, but I did.
Fantastic. Going on to our next question. So in addition to academic studies that you've just explained, have you ever studied with the ulama or the religious scholars of Islam? And if you did study with them, what did you study and with whom did you study with?
Yes, thank you very much. I did stay with him to some extent. I am not what you would call a student of knowledge, but I have completed some studies with them in Hanafi fiqh and also my studies in Sheikh al-Akbar. I will say that I have done a little bit of Hanafi fiqh with a student of Sheikh and Dr. Samar Nas. I have also, and am in the process actually. I still haven't completed my studies in Sheikh al-Akbar or Ibn al-Arabi, but I'm in the process of doing that with one of the masters in Jordan as well.
So have any of the scholars mentioned anything about Ibn Arabi, or did you learn anything from them, or do you just learn mainly Hanafi fiqh from these scholars? Hanafi fiqh meaning Hanafi jurisprudence. The Hanafi school of thought is one of the four major schools of thought in Sunni Islam, just to let the audience know.
Oh no, I mean, so his name was definitely brought up, but he would not have been studied in a madrasa setting. I mean, I did not go to madrasa, but he would not have been studied formally, but his name was brought up, and his name is always revered. I think that goes without saying, especially if it's I guess, a particularly traditional Sunni environment. And the same can also be said in the Shia world, where they study, if you go to certain places where they study Arsan, then his name would also be mentioned with reverence as well. His name is definitely known.
So the scholars did not discuss Ibn Arabi?
No, not quite, because like the majority of what Sheikh Al-Akbar has to say in his books, like his magnum opus, the Futuhat al-Makkiyya, and his other well-known book, the Fusus al-Hikam, are, I guess, rather advanced texts. So they would not discuss the contents of those books or those texts in those particular settings. I think they would deem them to be too advanced because I think the goal of a madrasa or halaqa or circles of knowledge is to promote and encourage the establishment of traditional Sunni knowledge, what people can use in their daily and practical life. But having said that, the study of what we call Akbarian metaphysics, which is kind of like the philosophical system of Ibn Arabi, even though the word philosophy is not quite correct to use, but the philosophical system of his Akbarian metaphysics was studied in these sorts of settings in the previous centuries, but it was kind of like removed from the curriculum, if you will, in the past 1 or 2 centuries.
Going to the next question, and at what point did you start expressing an interest in getting to know Ibn Arabi more?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. when I was in my undergraduate degree, I think maybe without knowing it, I was in search of someone who had insights that were deep and profound enough to answer the problems and challenges that we faced in our day and age. I think like profoundly challenging questions which your really average scholar could not handle. It would take someone with a certain level of depth to actually engage with the issues that we face in our contemporary age. So when I was thinking about that, just randomly, one of my friends walked up to me and said, "Faris, have you ever read this book? It was called The Quest for the Red Sulphur, which is a biography on the Sheikh al-Akbar. It's an academic study. One of the best ones out there." And I said, "No, I haven't." So when I read it, that was when I was introduced into the world of Ibn Arabi, and I knew that this was certainly something I had to learn more about without a shadow of a doubt.
That is indeed a very interesting book. I know that the same author, Claude Adas, wrote another book on Ibn Arabi. It's a shorter book called The Voyage of No Return. That's also a very good book.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yes.
So before researching Ibn Arabi's views on pluralism and salvation, what were you taught, or what was your understanding about Ibn Arabi's views on both?
I mean, I only came across his views on salvation, really, when I started reading the academic books that are well known in the field. So The Quest for the Red Sulphur, and then obviously after that, William Schick's Imaginal World, which is really fascinating because, by the way, the subject of this, the subject and topic of salvation is a huge one, right? But that's when I first came across it. And the first I think idea that I came across is that it's about the finality of suffering. The fact that suffering for the people of Jahannam, of hell, will come to an end at some point, right? That was the first idea I came across in the Quest for the Red Sulphur, because every single being is being led to their felicity, their sa'ada, irrespective of who they are, no matter how long it takes. Some people reach that particular stage of happiness sooner than others, but everyone will arrive at that point. So that was the first time I came across it.
And when you had learned Ibn Arabi's views on pluralism and salvation from the book and from some other sources, how did this influence your personal beliefs?
I think they aligned with my personal beliefs because I always, so this is one of the questions that I was wrestling with when I was younger, before I knew about Ibn Arabi. Like, why is suffering for the people of Jahannam eternal, right? It was a question that I was kind of like wrestling with. And so Ibn Arabi provide answers to that and how to answer or deal with that issue. I mean, there's more I want to say, but I'm just kind of like thinking through the answer here because it's quite a profound subject.
Yes, that's for sure. And what are your thoughts about the mainstream understanding of Muslim scholars? Hell goes on forever. Is that something you ever considered as a Muslim?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to know what was, I guess, the real answer, which is obviously something nearly impossible to get in this world. You find out what's right and wrong in the next world. But I also somehow felt intuitively that suffering couldn't just be eternal. So when I came across Shaykh al-Akbar, he provides you with proofs as to why it's not, but it's proofs from the Quran, proofs from the Sunnah in accordance with his metaphysical framework. So basically, he does not break what you call the letter of the law. He remains within the letter of the law. That's the, I think, most important point about him. That's the most salient feature of Ibn Arabi. He will always remain within the letter of the law. And that's one of the things that makes him so attractive to me. Because like you can have other views like Ibn Taymiyyah, where he says Jahannam itself comes to an end. But then you stumble across the problem of, okay, but the Quran says that the people of hell remain in hell forever. So how would you reconcile that, right? So you might be going against some of the Quranic verses. Ibn Arabi never does that. Ibn Arabi never does that. He remains within the letter of the Quran and the Sunnah itself. So I'll give you an example. Like when it says in the Quran, خَالِدِينَ فِيهَا أَبَدًا, they shall remain therein and abide therein forever and ever. The fiha is referring to the place, which is Jahannam. There is nothing in the Quran that says they shall remain to it It should remain therein forever to the extent that the pain itself is forever. So what he says is that for the people who remain in Jahannam and don't leave it, the pain is kind of like transmutated, is transformed into pleasure, which is a really ajib thing, because this idea is contained within the word itself. The adab, means chastisement, but the adab is also related to another word derived from the same trilateral root, the same etymology of adaba, from which you get azaba, sweetness, pleasure. So it's the chastisement that grants them pleasure at some point after the period of the punishment comes to an end. So he remains within the letter. He'll never contradict a Quranic ayah or what's in the Sunnah. And he's got like hundreds of proofs for that.
Very interesting. Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Abdel-hadi. So based on what you're saying, you're more compelled with and convinced with Ibn Arabi's way of dealing with the issues than, let's say, a lot of the mainstream Sunni scholars who spoke about the eternality of hell and punishment. Is that correct?
Oh, certainly. I think that Ibn Arabi's arguments are very compelling, and they're not just rational arguments. These are experiences he's had himself as a Sufi on the path where he witnesses Allah's mercy directly. Because it's mentioned in the hadith. The proofs are super compelling. Because, for example, there's a hadith Qudsi which says, my mercy has preceded my wrath. And the imagery used in Arabic, so it says, sabaqat, right? So it's a musabaqa, which means it's a horse race. So it's as if the divine names, mercy and wrath, are personified, and they're both racing one another to reach the object of control, which is the person who will either be punished or he will experience mercy, and then mercy wins out. That's just one example, and there's many other proofs for that. So I find this proofs very compelling. And the other scholars, I mean, I understand from your question that, implicitly what's being raised in your question is, how does Ibn Arabi's view compare to the mainstream Sunni view? Is Ibn Arabi himself even a Sunni? Yes, he's a staunch Sunni. But the other Sunni scholars, they can be divided into two broad camps. One is a group. So, for example, Sa'id Fawda belongs to this camp. He just plain disagrees with Ibn Arabi and his whole approach, and thinks his books aren't correct and shouldn't be read. So there is that camp. And there's a second camp, which really, they prefer to maintain their mainstream orthodox views, but they still revere Ibn Arabi, even to the extent they might consider some of his positions to be mistaken, but they revere him as a person without a shadow of a doubt. And they will not apply his positions themselves. Yeah, well, let's just leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Now that we've gotten to know you a little bit more, let's go to the book now. So the first question about the book is, why did you write the book? And apart from the fact that it was a debate happening on Ibn Arabi's views on pluralism and salvation, and you wanted to fill in the gaps, what else did you aim to achieve by your book?
Okay, thank you very much. Well, basically, the debate was one of the main reasons I wrote the book, because obviously prior to the book being published, there were two broad perspectives about Ibn Arabi. One perspective argued that he did not accept religious pluralism, and a second perspective argued that he in fact did. So I found that quite frustrating, because even if you have your own personal preferences and you would love for him to belong to your own view, even aside from that, even if he didn't, what's more frustrating than him not belonging to your own view or not advocating for your view, Ibn Arabi, is the fact that sometimes his views aren't clear. So for an academic, that's quite frustrating. So I wanted to at least clear away the confusion. And so what I got in the end was a very interesting result where he actually subscribes to both views. He's both inclusivist and he's also exclusivist. And the other reason I wrote the book was because I wrote the book for people, I'm hoping, who are like myself, who find these issues to be very compelling and necessary. And they're the sort of people who cannot stop thinking about these issues. And it's very important to them. No one has provided an answer to these questions. So I'm hoping to provide something for such people. Like, for example, when I grew up in my high school in Dubai, the overwhelming majority of people were from India. And certainly a large portion of the school were Hindus. And I took my Islamic class in that setting, in which you're just simply taught that, people of other religions are non-believers, which is fine for the mainstream view, but that says nothing about the way you should interact with them or think about them, which is really weird if you understand what I mean. It's very strange because we need a narrative that allows us to engage with them and not just simply write them off as the other. And so I wanted to write something for people who might benefit from that.
Would you like to change the minds of more Muslims who follow the mainstream view of these issues to a more, you can say, inclusive view that values non-Muslim faiths more?
I don't think I'm very interested in changing people's views, like I don't see myself as a proselytizer. I really don't like to proselytize or evangelize. I think people should be free to think what they want to think. But what I do want to do is to make this Ecuadorian perspective more widely known, because I think education is very important. And so what maybe we are lacking today in the curricula of mainstream Islamic education is the presentation of variety of perspectives, and students should be free to choose what view they find most compelling. And it's our job to present those views. So even for example, I'm not a fan of Ibn Taymiyyah, and yet he's a very important scholar. And so at least there should be a really solid understanding of his writings so people can present his views on what God is or what God isn't, for example. And then they decide for themselves whether they want to follow his views or not. It's the same with Ibn Arabi. We live in a day and age where his writings are widely accessible. Now we need someone to, at the very least, give a fair presentation of what his views are. That's the kind of time we live in. So that's what I'm interested in doing, as opposed to changing people's minds, if that makes sense.
Of course. Thank you. Going to the next question. So in writing this book, who are the people involved in supporting you?
For me, mainly my PhD supervisors, the Rizvi, mainly.
So no other scholars were involved in reviewing the manuscript?
Again, I'm not sure if they want me to mention their names or anything, but I will say that there was minimal, I guess, supervision over the manuscript. I've not really consulted traditional scholars or local scholars over the manuscript. Not really. It's quite minimal.
Okay, thank you. So now let's get to the meat of the book. Can you please give us a short summary of your main arguments and conclusion about Ibn Arabi's views on pluralism and salvation?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, I wanted to write a book that could be accessed by more people. So I hope I will do that inshallah in the future. Right now, this is a book that is geared more towards academics, and necessarily so because if you cannot answer this question and kind of iron out the issues that are involved in this question, then there's no point in writing a book that's more for the wider public. So it's a book that's mainly for academics, but I've tried to make it as readable as possible for everyone. And the main argument is it explores what are Ibn Arabi's views on the religious other, and it all centers around a passage that is key to this discussion, and it's key to this argument. And I call it the celestial metaphor or the sun metaphor. And it was first translated by William Sheddick in his book, Imaginal Worlds, which says that Islam basically abrogates the other religions, but there's a metaphor for that. And the metaphor for abrogation is that Islam is comparable to the sun and the other religions are comparable to the stars. So when the sun rises, obviously not one of the stars can be seen, which is the metaphor for Islamic abrogation. But then he goes on and he continues to speak and he says, but nevertheless, use your intellect. Because when you use your intellect, you know that intellectually the stars are still present. We know that the stars are still present. You just can't see them. They're not visible to your eye, which means that the religions continue to remain in what might be called an occult manner. So O-C-C-U-L-T, an occult manner. The previous religions continue to remain in a hidden manner, right? But albeit unseen. Nevertheless, this abrogation does not make the previous religions batil. This is what he says. They don't become batil. They don't become false through this abrogation. If someone thinks that, he says, that's the opinion of the ignoramus. He's an ignoramus. He's jahil, if he thinks that. So that's the main metaphor. So now I want to explore through this metaphor what is Ibn Arabi's views on the other religion. What I argue in the first two chapters is that what's happening here is that he's using Sufi terminology. He's using Sufi ideas, which is fana baqa. Fana baqa, which translates into annihilation and subsistence. He's using the same Sufi ideas to illustrate what abrogation is. So on the one hand, the other religions are annihilated. In other words, they don't continue to exist once the Muhammadan religion arises. They don't really, especially to your eyesight, like you don't see them, right? So this is fana. And then the second chapter goes into how, but nevertheless, they do continue to subsist in some manner, since we know that they exist, the stars exist intellectually, since the religions are compared to the stars, right? They continue to subsist in some manner. The question is how. The short answer is that they continue to subsist through the Muhammadan religion. Now, the one perspective that guides most of my thinking is what I call a non-reductive pluralism, which is to say that instead of taking a binary view, in other words, all religions are simply null and void, or we accept all religions without condition, there's a middle ground, which is non-reductive pluralism. And it's a word I borrowed from another scholar, Muhammad Legenhausen, but I give it my own meaning, but the word I've borrowed from him. So I think Ibn Arabi is a non-reductive pluralist, in which he says that the other religions continue to subsist, but it's like you've got to take the permission of how they subsist from Muhammad himself first. And these other religions, they continue to exist under his aegis, under the umbrella of the Sharia. So once you find the permission of how they continue to subsist through a Sharia, then they continue to exist, albeit with his permission. That's the argument in a nutshell. Then the rest of the book is just dedicated to exploring, once you accept that idea, how they might subsist. And really, no matter what religion that is, it's not just Christianity and Judaism. It's any, I think with the use of Ibn Arabi's metaphysics, you can dialogue and see the merit of any religion in the entire world, I think, without exaggeration. And the reason for that is because of his own metaphysics, his own spiritual system and philosophy, which underpins the Sharia, which underpins the Shari'i implementation of how you permit the other religions to subsist. Why? Because every person worships Allah whether they know it or not. That's his metaphysics, which is based on certain Quranic verses and hadith. أَيْنَمَا تُوَلُّوا فَثَمَّ وَجْهَ اللَّهِ. Wheresoever you turn, there is the face of God. Which means we are obliged to acknowledge all directions as being ontologically divine, even though the Quran command for a Muslim is to but turn your face to where? To the Qibla of the Kaaba, even though you know that the other directions are divine. So his metaphysics entails that wujud is Allah. That's the basis of his metaphysics. Wujud is Allah is being, Allah is existence. And so whatever we perceive in existence is just a manifestation or the effects or traces of what? His divine names. But wheresoever you turn, you will see Allah in wujud. And everything is his madhar, or the locus of manifestation for his being and for his names and attributes. And so, just to quickly round this off, that's what the rest of the book explores, particularly with regard to his meeting with the sun worshippers. He details his meeting of the sun worshippers in chapter 69 and 72 of the Futuhat, where he explains his metaphysics, which is combined with his understanding of the Sharia and how they're both intertwined, right? The metaphysics of belief. How does our belief entail a connection to God, how we perceive God, and therefore how he in turn manifests himself in accordance with our beliefs? It's really quite extraordinary. And there's more I want to say about that, but I want to give you a chance to respond.
Sure, thank you. So digging in a little deeper into the annihilation and subsistence. So what parts of those religions, according to Ibn Arabi, are correct, and which parts of those religions are not correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So, right, let's try and put it this way. Ibn Arabi does subscribe to mainstream views about what's wrong with other religions. So he does, for example, believe the previous scriptures to be corrupted. He believes that. That's called tahrif. And there's tahrif al-ma'ani, and there's tahrif al-huruf, right? So there's textual corruption, or there's corruption in meaning of, let's say, the Torah and the Injil, the gospel or the gospels. He subscribes to that, and he subscribes to other mainstream views about what he would consider to be mistakes in other religions, like the portrayal of the prophets in the Old Testament. He finds quite abhorrent, actually. But having said that, even if there are or there is corruption in the previous religions. The subsistence is that once they pay the jizya, they still have the right to practice their religion. Now, this is with regard to the Jews and the Christians specifically when we discuss the topic of jizya. Once they pay the poll tax, they have the right to practice their religion, which still contains truth and light. That's mentioned explicitly in the Quran. The Quran explicitly mentions their corruption and explicitly mentions the light that's contained in the Torah and the light that's contained in the Gospel. So once they pay the jizya, they have the right to practice their religion. So there could be individual elements of the religion which are considered to be incorrect, but you still nevertheless have the right to practice it for particular reasons. This is explicitly stated with regard to ijtihad, right? For example, it's wrong for the sun worshiper to bow down to the sun and call God, for example, because divinity only belongs to God. But the sun is God's manifestation, his madhar, nevertheless. But if he arrived at his active worship through the means of ijtihad, which means to struggle and strive to seek the truth, if he did it through ijtihad, his worship is permitted to him, nevertheless, even though it's called a mistake. So one scholar I consulted on the issue of the jizya, I'll come back to the jizya now, I asked him about it, and he said that the whole point of the jizya is the Ahl Kitab, the people of the book, who are the Jews and the Christians, they are permitted to remain upon the religion because they have doubts concerning the veracity and truth of the coming of our messenger, Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. They don't know if he is true or not. So they have what's called shukuk, doubts about Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Okay, because they have doubts about him, they are permitted to pay the jizya instead of becoming Muslims, instead of lieu of formal conversion. But this does not mean that we confirm the shukuk, the doubts themselves, but the way the scholar I asked put it was, he said, we're confirming you based on your doubts. We're not confirming the doubts themselves. That's the fine line.
Very interesting. Did you find any contradictory passages as you read Ibn Arabi's works?
I didn't find that many contradictory passages. I only found one, actually, that I consider to be a contradiction. He is very consistent in the way he writes. You just have to be very patient when reading him. He would not have changed his views over time. I don't know any scholar, like serious scholar of Ibn Arabi, who felt that he changed his views over time. Like maybe he refined his writing over time for when he was younger and when he became older, but he might have refined his terminology a little bit. But rather extraordinarily, he's never changed his views. I've never seen him change his views. Like let's say he says in one passage, I think all people in hell will suffer eternally. And then he says something else later on. No, he's very, very consistent as he continued to write throughout his life. The one passage that I found that might have been a contradiction was he does talk about in one passage about a group of sun worshippers who are mentioned in the hadith. I think it's Sahih Muslim, where he mentions that Jahannam comes running after them because of their prostration towards the sun. And the hadith is to do with the timing of burial, when you bury someone who died. So it's forbidden to do it at midday. He's giving you the reason for that, because at midday, that's when sun worshippers prostrate towards the sun, for example. And then the person who is deceased might become terrified, like in his grave, when he sees Jahannam running after the sun worshippers. So my, method for addressing that contradiction is that he wasn't addressing the sun worshippers that he physically met in the flesh, right, in Anatolia, or whom he says he met. So I know there's another issue raised about whether he met them in the flesh or not. And this is what other scholars raise as well. But the fact is, whether he met them in the flesh or not, he met them in some way or some manner, right? That's different to commenting on a generic hadith. That's different to commenting on a generic hadith where he's describing a generic group who could not be the specific group of sun worshippers that he had met, because he says that they, according to his discussion with them, he concluded that they arrived at their way of worship through ijtihad. Whereas the second group mentioned in the hadith, it seems like they did it not through ijtihad, possibly through taqleed. So when you do something through taqleed, that's when you get into trouble, generally speaking. But when it's through ijtihad, you are excused. So those are two different concepts and two different things being discussed. So taqleed is basically the opposite of ijtihad. If ijtihad is the effort to struggle and find out what the truth is for yourself, whether it be in the furu' or the usul. And by the way, Ibn Arabi says that it's in the furu' or the usul, which means it's in the branches and the legal application of the law, or it's in the foundational creedal beliefs of the law, like the basic belief system of what God is and what his messengers are, right? That's called the usul, the foundational principle. The Arabi permits you to do ijtihad in either one, which is unusual, because it's called usually only permit people to do ijtihad in the furu' only, which is the legal ramifications of the religion. So taqlid is the opposite of that. Taqlid means to follow. Taqlid is following. I like to think of it as blind following, but not everyone agrees with that. It means to follow someone, but really you're following someone through the suspension of your intellect. Now, it's possible to follow someone and not suspend your intellect. It's connected to the qilada, which is the necklace, kind of like a chain, or it's as if you're chained to the person you're following. So it doesn't matter if a third person were to present you with proofs as to why your following is incorrect, you will still follow the person you are attached to, if you like. That's taqlid.
So if this meeting, let's say, didn't actually happen in the flesh with the sun worshippers, Ibn Arabi's meeting with the sun worshippers, let's say it happened in a dream or in some otherworldly experience, is it possible that a dream cannot be really used to represent Ibn Arabi's views or even our views when we dream, because it's just a dream?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It makes no difference whatsoever. It makes absolutely no difference, because for Ibn Arabi, there's different realms of being. So all the realms of being have a certain degree of reality. Now, with regard to textual analysis, he is still making an argument for the acceptance of their belief based on what the Sharia can provide for them. It does not matter. This is like a didactic moral story he created in order to illustrate a point, or whether this actually happened in the physical world. It makes no difference either way, because what we're looking at is the argument. He is creating an argument in which he is explaining why sun worshippers have the belief system that they believe in, and how the Sharia accounts for that. How does the Sharia account for that particular belief system through its tools, if you like ijtihad and usul al-fiqh, for example, amongst other tools, and the maqasid of Sharia, which is translated as the goals of the law. And then, besides that, you've got multiple references and passages throughout the Futuhat and Fusus al-Hikam that support that argument anyways. So he is consistent, in other words. So whether it happens in a dream or not is not the point. But let me say something else as well, just to drive the point home. In some cases, they consider what happens so the dream world is also called the imaginal world, the barzakh, right?
Right.
Sometimes it's more real than what happens in this world. So sometimes it can annoy a Sufi if you get too focused on this world.
So do you think your book will lead to more reconciliation among people or more division? So while your interpretation of Ibn Arabi's views of salvation can be used to maybe bring people together, do you think an opposition might form among the Muslims to discourage this kind of effort?
Yes, and it has happened. When I gave a presentation once on one chapter of the Futuhat, there was a nice lad, actually from the Ba'alawi Tariqa. I think I might have given the lad a heart attack, possibly. He might have nearly had a heart attack when I discussed what he said, because he loves Ibn Arabi. But that's the thing about Sunni Muslims. They love the image of Ibn Arabi. But once you get into his texts, it's a whole other question. And he's a nice lad, but he did not like what I was talking about at all. So my impression is that I don't think this book is necessarily going to lead to more reconciliation at the moment, because we don't have the educational infrastructure to present to people what Ibn Arabi is to begin with. People don't know who he is. I do think what this book will do, and what it was intended to do, is for people who are having trouble reconciling the kind of like exclusivist and inclusivist elements that do exist within the Quran, for example, and within Islam. If people have trouble bringing them together, then I think this book will allow them to do that. And it's written for those kinds of people, really. But it's not really going to change too many people's minds. But people who are either confused about the issue, I think it will give them some clarification. Or if there's something on the sense, then it will allow them to come down on the issue one way or another.
Speaking of changing minds, do you think Professor Gregory Lipton is going to change his mind after reading chapter 3 of your book? And I guess there are more chapters in your book that went against his interpretations of Ibn Arabi's views. Another question is, were you able to consult Gregory Lipton before writing or while writing? Did you just want to challenge him by writing the book first and then letting him know?
So first of all, whether he'll change his mind or not, I cannot speak to that question as to whether he will change his mind or not. Time will tell. But, notwithstanding that, he's obviously a brilliant and erudite scholar. But I have not written to him. And by the way, you're not the first person to ask this question. Some people have also suggested to me that I write to him and present to him my views prior to publishing the book, but I really wasn't sure as to whether what I have to say is meaningful to either Gregory Lipton or, let's say, Sheikh Noor, for example. I think Sheikh Noor has gone on from the issue. He's moved on from this question a long time ago. I don't think it interests him anymore, for example. And Gregory Lipton, yeah, I'm not sure why I felt like I didn't want to write to him, but I think it seemed to me that I think an academic, once he puts forward a point of view, he's just not going to change it. But I could be wrong. But I think that was just that was just my thinking at the time. I think, well, now that I think about it, I think it's because we have such radically different understandings of what and who Ibn Arabi is. I just didn't see the point because my own understanding of Ibn Arabi is vastly different from his. And it's like I mentioned before at the beginning of this podcast, I'm not interested in changing people's minds necessarily. So because we have such different takes on who Ibn Arabi is and what his stance on religious pluralism is, I just didn't see a point because it really is diametrically opposite.
Great, thank you. What would you say are aspects of your research that might require further investigation? In other words, are there any gaps that you think still remain on the topic, and can a PhD student, for example, build on your research, if at all?
Yes, of course. There's always more that remains to be done. Like Ibn Arabi, he's such a vast figure. For example, his Futuhat is thousands and thousands of pages. Not everyone's read it fully. I myself am still in the process of trying to complete it. And he's written hundreds of books. I think that, of course, a PhD student could build on what I'm writing for sure, because the nature of this whole enterprise is to be an ongoing collaborative project. I definitely think a PhD student could build on my insights. I don't know if I can point to anything specific, but yes, he could certainly build on it for sure.
And do you think if a student builds on your research and reads the books you have not read or did not read for this research that you've done for the book, that the conclusions might come out different?
Well, the position I've tried to take in this book, which I understood is Ibn Arabi's, as I understand it, unless I'm mistaken, is that it's a middle position, which means it takes both views into account, his exclusivism and his inclusivism. And because of that, I don't foresee that the conclusion will change, because that would have to mean there'd be some third element that I didn't consider. There's only exclusivism and inclusivism and what it means to bring them together. So I don't think the main ideas of the conclusion will change. Possibly one or two details, but I don't anticipate that the main premises will change.
Do you plan on building on your research in any way? And what is your next research project? Is it going to be on Ibn Arabi, or is it going to be on an entirely different topic?
Yes, there is more to be done. So because the majority of the book was written to establish how does the Sharia account for other people's belief systems, it was only towards the end of the book that I touched upon topics that I really wanted to expand upon, which can come in another book, which means now we can get into the metaphysics, properly speaking, of how do we conceive of other religions through the metaphysics of Ibn Arabi. And there's so much that can be said about that. For example, I'm still not finished with the question of how does Ibn Arabi conceive of other polytheistic religions. There's much more that can be said about that, because there's a very strong connection to the way he personifies the divine names, right? and the way he treats the divine names. It's really incredible and fascinating. And then my next immediate project is a translation project. I will be translating one of his books, which is called the كتاب الأجوبة العربية في نصائح اليوسفية, which is the book of Arabic answers as given to Yusuf. And it's a manual on suluk, but it's also a microcosm of the main themes that are found in the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, which is an extraordinary work. So I'm about 1/4 of the way through, and that's the next one I'll be doing, inshallah.
Interesting. And why did you pick this book of all of his books?
Perhaps because I was foolish, I'm not sure. But I was very attracted to the main themes in this book, but it's actually turning out to be a lot more work than I anticipated initially. But I was very fascinated by the stories and the themes they talked about and the lessons they gives. And if it wasn't for the issues there, I think I'm coming across in the manuscript, it's a very readable risala. It's a very readable book or epistle, which I think will appeal to many people, especially if they are spiritual seekers. So that's one.
Thank you, Dr. Abdel-hadi. And finally, Dr. Abdel-hadi, would you like to share any last words of wisdom for our audience that you think might benefit them through all your research on Ibn Arabi, and anything you would like to share?
Yeah, there is a passage from the Kitab al-Azhar, which I thought was fantastic. I just don't have it in front of me right now, which is unfortunate. But it's to do with the fact that he's talking about if you want to reach knowledge of God, then it's very simple. You have to comport yourself with good manners towards God and creation. So I would say a good place to leave this podcast would be to say one ought to really have a good opinion, personal dhan, of all of God's creatures and creation without exception, and to treat them all well without exception. And if one does that, then you've basically grasped an essential component of the path.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdel-hadi, for sharing your wisdom and your insights.
And thanks so much for having me, Zubair. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. Your curiosity and support mean everything. I hope you learned something today. And as always, feel welcome to send questions about the book to Dr. Abdel-hadi or even myself. On that note, I look forward to doing the next podcast. Thank you.